Claudia-Liza
Well,
TV.
luckily, we have an expert joining us in the studio now. Joining us is Jason Reid. He is UK lead at Young Voices and political commentator. An extraordinary week in Westminster, yet another extraordinary week in Westminster. How do you read it?
Completely extraordinary. It feels that every week is more extraordinary than the last, doesn't it? I mean, the excuse about the tractors was what pushed this one over the edge, I think. That's up there with driving to Barnard Castle to test your eyesight, isn't it?
It really is.
Dominic Cummings was doing during lockdown.
It reminds me of when I was a doctor, and you know, you'd ask how people got into certain positions, and they'd say things like, I was hoovering in the nude. It's that kind of ridiculous...
Is that what was said?
Oh, you have no idea. But, I mean, it's those sort of ridiculous explanations for things where we know that isn't probably what happened. But obviously that, and then just looking at the whole mess, the fact is we've lost 2 Conservative MPs in 1 week, more by-elections. Where do you think trust is now in politics?
It's at an all-time low, and it's just... going lower and lower every week, it seems, plunging to new depths all the time. It's just incredible that our politicians behave in this way. I think it's building a bridge as well between politics and policy, because the way that our politicians are behaving is informing their policy. We've seen the growth of the nanny state, for example, over COVID and over countless other issues as well, because our politicians, I think they look down on us. I think they look down on normal people. They think people are stupid. I think Neil Parish wouldn't have said this excuse about the tractor website unless he thought that people were quite stupid and they would believe it.
I just... wrote a little list last night of things that are going on. You've got Boris Johnson and Partygate, Keir Starmer and Angela Rayner. Then you've got Neil Parish and his porn. You've got Imran Ahmed Khan, who's obviously been convicted over the sexual assault of a 15-year-old. Rishi Sunak's tax affairs, of course, then involving his wife. Jamie Wallace crashing his car and running off. Then you've got Claudia Webb, who then was convicted of harassing a love rival. Liam Byrne, who was suspended for bullying. What is going on?
And this doesn't even include the allegations that we're hearing as well, including from the International Trade Secretary just last week. So yes, a lot going on.
And also didn't mention David Warburton and his piles of dandruff that he's photographed next to.
I mean, the whole thing is extraordinary, and I think what it does is it undermines the sanctity of that place. Well, I was going to say there are some brilliant MPs out there. There really are some good ones, but I think they're being overshadowed.
They are, and this is the problem, is that so often when these scandals come up, the temptation is so strong to use it to score points. And, you know, you have a bash at the government or you have a bash at the opposition, depending on which party the particular MP happens to be in. But the sheer volume, as you've just highlighted, of the scandals we're seeing at the moment means that it's a cultural issue about politicians in general. We need to think really deeply about what it means to work in Westminster and how we can make people who work there feel a bit safer and make it feel like a bit more of a 21st century workplace rather than a medieval workplace.
So in the Times this morning, they had a journalist talking about her time in Westminster. She used to work in Parliament. She worked her way up to become a researcher, and she spoke about the levels, the constant level, she described it, of sexual harassment that she faced there, and it reduced significantly once she became a journalist. And of course, men would be very, very worried about what she would report on. And now you have to look at how this will impact the local elections in just a few days' time, and the by-elections. And the Mail on Sunday is reporting that Labour and the Lib Dems are ready to stitch up, they're calling it stitch up Boris Johnson, stitch up the Tory party.
I'm a little bit sceptical about this, because we hear this almost every time there's an election cycle, don't we?
Though? No?
Well, sort of, but I mean, it never seems to last more than about 5 minutes, because it's very easy to say, well, let's just all unite and defeat the incumbents, but it's never quite that simple when you actually go ahead and do it. Having said that, I think there might be enough in it for the Lib Dems to go a long way on their own in many cases.
You know, obviously I have to be slightly careful what I say, given that we're in Purda and I am politically affiliated, but certainly on the doorstep, regardless of who people are going to vote for, there is such a lack of trust now in politicians and in the political process, and my real sadness is that the actual numbers that will go out and vote will be very low, particularly in the local elections, unless they believe they can give the government a bloody nose. But as you know, local elections are fought on very different issues, aren't they?
Exactly, yeah. In local elections you have all these different peripheral issues that aren't usually at top of the agenda that suddenly come to the fore. They usually have low turnouts anyway, and as you say, trust in politics is so low at the moment that it's hard to see what's motivating people to go out and be enthusiastic. It seems to me that the only reason people feel that they want to go out and vote or they want to be passionate is to keep people out rather than put people in who they really support.
Which is so negative.
Exactly, exactly.
But do you think we should then move to compulsory voting? I think they do it in Australia.
I'm not sure that's the solution. I think it's easy to say, isn't it? But we just need a better politics, effectively. That's the only solution. Dragging people in against their will, that won't make them feel engaged.
So what I find really interesting is there's such a disconnect when you talk to people. So they say, well, I hate this lot, but there's no alternative.
Yeah.
But the thing is, they then vote tribally. Yeah. But if you do that, you never change anything.
And yesterday, David, you were talking about a first past the post,
yes.
Which is obviously the kind of system we use when it comes to voting in the general elections. That could change, or the effectiveness or how genuinely representative it is of people could change if you do have actually compulsory voting. If you have a significant number of people going out there to vote, that could change how indeed elections are won.
It could. There's a lot of thinking going on at the moment about the British political system, because for a long time it seemed like we have a really, really good system, and I think we do have a really good system when you compare it to some of our European neighbours, and they have coalitions with, 13 different parties in government, and there's constantly negotiations going on to try to keep the government together from falling apart. We don't really have that issue, but at the same time we have our own issues with the government. Then you can't properly hold them to account because they have such a big majority, and so all creative thinking just goes out the window.
So one thing that strikes me is that clearly politics has changed over my lifetime. We are now living in a 24-hour news environment. The fact is everyone's on Twitter, everyone's saying things all the time. I don't think many politicians give much of a considered response. If they're caught on the hoof and they're interviewed by a news outlet, they come up with something which they later retract, which is found to be untrue. Do you think that's part of the problem, that actually the 24-hour news cycle has basically made these politicians act differently, and they are no longer considered, they're no longer thoughtful, and they no longer care in the same way?
I think the 24-hour news cycle is a good thing for people, because that's just a feature of the modern age. We have more instant access to information, which we all want all the time, and that's great. The problem is the way the politicians respond to it, because they just, as you say, they make things up on the hoof, and so every single policy decision that's made, you can easily find 6 different opinions on it, usually from within the cabinet, depending on what mood and what time of day it is and all these different things. They find it really difficult to make sense as a cohesive unit.
So can I just ask you one thing which I find very interesting? Within the Labour Party and within Conservative Party, you've obviously got different groups of people, haven't you? And you've got different tribes within them. What's your take on the Conservative Party at the moment? They feel they're sort of tolerating Boris because, we talked about that yesterday, that he is actually a vote winner. It's that, kind of like him, whether you like him or not, just because of his character.
He's a winner. You've got to give him that.
But I get the sense that, when we saw all these letters going into the 1922 committee and then they withdrew them, and I know some letters are back in, is he on a stay of execution?
I think he's going to last a long, long time. I think he's Teflon Boris. He's not going to
No, really?
Okay, wait. What about we're still waiting Sue Gray's full report.
Yes.
Still awaiting the conclusion of the investigation into whether he intentionally lied to Parliament. If those do go badly for Boris Johnson, if they don't go his way, you still think he could last then?
I still think, because the Partygate scandal looked for a while the most likely to unseat him, but it's just that people aren't angry enough about it anymore. He's been successful in kicking the can down the road, dragging it out, to the point that now it's very easy to point to arguably much bigger issues like Ukraine and the cost of living crisis.
And in some ways he was, I'm not saying, it's an awful thing that's going on in Ukraine, but in some ways he was lucky that, he could then assume the role of a world statesman.
Boris Johnson is the definition of luck. We've had Rishi Sunak's downfall lately, which was very convenient.
That was very, very convenient. I wonder who was behind, behind all
You're
of
not
that,
saying
right?
skullduggery.
I'm just saying...
You're not.
I'm saying it was crazy convenient is what I'm saying.
So skullduggery,
Well, hey, it's politics, so that wouldn't be a strange thing.
Can I just ask you one other thing? I've just seen a tweet from Guy Verhofstadt, my arch nemesis in the European Union, saying, on the Conference on the Future of Europe approves radical overhaul of the EU. This is ending of the unanimity, the abolishment of the veto system, launch of the joint armed forces of the Union, all the things we campaigned against. So clearly, us leaving, they're now going down that federal European project.
It is a little bit comforting to see what happens in the European Union after we've left, and as bonkers as our politicians might be and all the crazy decisions they make, at least we don't have to deal with this as well anymore. I remember when the Brexit campaign was going on and people were talking about how there was going to be a European army and closer integration, all this kind of thing, and the other side said, no, you're scaremongering, that's definitely not going to happen, and here we have one of the EU's most senior cheerleaders.
I'm glad you said that, because I was banging on about it the whole time, saying this is exactly where we're going to a federal army, a federal, you know, one single European army, which is fine if that's what you want.
Okay,
but anyway.
Jason Reed, UK leader at Young Voices, good talking to you as always. Thanks so much for coming in this morning.